Okay, welcome everybody. I'm really sorry for the late start, but there was a big group in here that took some time to clear out, I gather. We're really lucky today for the second of this year's Cutting Edge Issues in Development Thinking and Practice to have the lineup that we do. We have some very well-known people who have had different sorts of experiences interacting with development and development aid. I'm going to introduce them first, and then I'm going to say a few things to get us started, because the way we're going to do tonight is not a bunch of long speeches, but through a kind of panel discussion to start off with, questions and some answers from the panelists to those questions, and then we'll as always, open it up to the Q&A from the floor. Yeah. So, for me, it's such a pleasure to have Clare Short come back to speak to the students, because she has a really unique perspective. Clare is a native of Birmingham, and she was first elected to Parliament.
Birmingham Handsworth, you know that place where Jenrick found no white people? That's where I'm from.
Yes, that's right. I should have said that. In 1983, yeah. So during that time, she had been, or during her time in Parliament, she was first Shadow Minister for Women, Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, an opposition spokesperson for overseas development. That's when I first met her, just before the new Labour government came to power in 1997. She was the first Secretary of State for International Development and presided over the building of the Department for International Development, which really, under Clare's leadership, transformed the role of Britain in international aid, overcame some of the really negative views about Britain in international aid that had come from all sorts of corruption and arms scandals and whatnot in the decade before. And she built that into a very effective organization with a very effective aid program. And she was there until she resigned from government in 2003 in the aftermath, or while the Iraq War was going on. She resigned the Labour whip in 2006 and left Parliament in 2010. Afterwards, she's been involved with a number of important causes. She chaired the Executive Industries Transparency Initiative, which looked after some kind of ethical basis for dealing with minerals and mining. And she was author of a book which you may want to look at called An Honorable Deception, New Labour Iraq and the Misuse of Power in 2004. Clare, I also discovered this morning another book I hadn't really seen before, and it's called Dear Clare, This is What Women Feel, about page 3. Clare, in her early career in Parliament, she was involved in campaigning against pornography, and we had this horrible tabloid press with page 3 girls on it, and it was such an interesting campaign that so many people wrote letters to Clare, and she published these in a volume. Clare has been an outspoken activist, supporter of the Palestinian people's cause and many other issues around immigration and women. Secondly, we have Kevin Watkins. So now, I guess I'm an old guy, so I can talk about when I met these people. I met Kevin a couple of months after I came to this country in the middle of the 1980s. Yeah. And he was already working as quite a firebrand young researcher at the Catholic Institute for International Relations. He went on to do major work in the NGO community. I think from there he first went to Oxfam, heading up their research and policy work. And then later he was director of the United Nations Development Program's Human Development Report. He presided over putting 3 of these out, which I think is a monumental effort. They covered climate change, they covered, the second one was beyond scarcity, power, poverty, and global water crisis. and then international cooperation at the crossroads. Aid, trade, and security, it goes on. Today, Kevin has worked also as head of Save the Children Fund. He cleaned up that organization, I think. And he was also director of the Overseas Development Institute. Now he's working with his colleagues in Brazil in the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger. So I can't think of anybody next best to Clare Short to talk about aid than Kevin, who's been looking and scrutinizing the work in this sector for many years. And then Deborah Doane is the young one on the panel who I met coming into my office in 1996, October. This seems like yesterday to me. Coming from Canada, knowing not too much about international development, I don't think at the time, but really became quite a star in that year's student contingent, and went on to work and have a career so far in international non-governmental organizations. She convenes something called the Reimagining the INGO Project, or RINGO, and famously has authored this book, which I think is selling very well. You might want to have a look. It's not too long. I know students don't like long books these days. Some people on my course will find perhaps that it's on the reading list. And it's a critical assessment of the role of INGOs based on firsthand experience in a number of these organizations. She's been director of Funders Initiative for Civil Society, director of World Development Movement, and founder, director of Corporate Responsibility Coalition, connected with that, a trustee of the Fair Trade Foundation, and a board member of the Board of Finance Uncovered. So I think the combined expertise of these three people is excellent for tonight. Okay, let me just say a few words before I turn to the people who you really want to hear from. You know, we're holding this discussion at a very crucial moment. I mean, it's a moment that has seen the deepest aid cuts probably since the beginning of official development aid. The Guardian had a piece just a few days ago that was suggesting that the cuts in the UK aid budget will bring down aid to something like 0.3% of GDP. And they said this could lead to 300,000 deaths. I mean, I think Clare, more than anybody else, will say this whole debate about what percentage of GDP is not the important issue, but the issue about the nature and the depth and the abruptness of these cuts is really quite startling. UK is set to reduce by 20% its funding to the Global Fund that fights AIDS, tuberculosis, and TB, on top of 30% cuts last year. So this is really putting into question the possibilities of providing the life-saving antiretroviral drugs that have been used to fight the HIV/AIDS. Oxfam last June said the cuts are a death sentence for millions. And in countries like Liberia, Haiti, Malawi, and South Sudan, U.S. aid is made up to over 40% of health and education budgets being removed. You know, so this is really having a huge effect. For anybody who wants to look in more detail at the data, you look at the OECD DAC report, most recently in June 2025, you know, and they're suggesting that it's going to be between 9 to 17% of total ODA cut in 2025, and that's modest compared to other estimates. So this is really a moment of deep cuts. some argue, and we want to explore these different dimensions of the cuts, that perhaps all of this is a blessing in disguise. We've heard about the geopolitical purposes of aid in the past, that there's some African leaders, the president of Zambia recently was echoing many African countries when he said that, it's maybe time to be less dependent on aid. But what he opposed in particular, was the rapidity of these cuts, because there's been no possibility to prepare for them. The scale of the challenge with the degree of cuts is really big when you look at things like climate change. So all efforts to kind of finance the actions necessary for adaptation and mitigation of the effects of climate change, particularly in the poor countries, in the least developed countries, are jeopardized. There's a requirement for a huge financial transfer if any of this is going to, if it's going to be possible for these countries to be able to respond to these kind of challenges. And maybe, and we can talk about this too, maybe all of this does, suggest that it's time, as Hajin Chung was saying in our last lecture, to start talking again about a new international economic order, or what he called a new international economic order. So I'm hoping we can debate and discuss some of these issues through the next hour or so, and then we open it up to all your questions from the floor. Okay? Thank you. So it's great to have you here, and I thought maybe we should start from that point. That point about given the scale of the cuts in aid. Some are saying this is a total disaster because the resources that are being removed from development, but others say, well, maybe it's a blessing in disguise because of all the power that's been exercised, the dependency created, et cetera, through the processes of aid. So maybe we just start with that general issue. And Claire, I don't know if you'd like to go first.
I think my microphone is on, but this...
It is on.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there's
Yes.
a green light.
It annoys me just to make the whole discussion of development about aid. Because aid can be spent well or badly, distributed in different ways. For example, now, after Ukraine became recognised as a middle-income country, in 24 it received 86% as much as the whole of Africa. Now, that's not to say maybe Ukraine needs some help, but should the poorest people in the world pay? And in Britain, this is relatively new, but now all those wretched hotels with all these asylum seekers waiting forever to get a decision on their case, it's paid out of the aid budget. So just talking about the money isn't it. And of course, also, we need to talk about what are the trade rules, what are the taxation arrangements, etc., etc. So I think it's really important not to narrow the discussion of development to just aid, but then some money is needed, particularly, of course, in humanitarian disasters when there's been war or famine or flood and people are displaced and there's nothing. Then some money is needed to just keep people fed and so on to get through the crisis. And that money will be more and more squeezed. And also, the poorest people are now in countries that are emerging from or caught in conflict. And there needs to be some help to keep people going and to help countries rebuild their institutions. And of course, how you do aid is important for that, because I'm a great believer in budgetary aid. Putting the money through the government systems, therefore they have to make sure they're transparent, and building up a capacity to provide education or healthcare for people in the country itself. So it's not endless dependency, but creating the capacity, especially in a country that's been through war and chaos, to take care of itself. So, the cuts in aid are crude and rude, and it shows about the values that are swirling around the international system, and you see that all over the place. What's been happening in Gaza, who would ever have believed something unforgivable and as evil as that could go on in front of our eyes for 2 whole years. So we're in a very bad stage in human history. And the speed with which the cuts came, as the president of Zambia said, means there wasn't any time to adjust. But there were things about the whole aid system, when it wasn't budgetary aid, and when there's lots of actors in development and they constantly call on governments and try to boss them around and tell them what to do, and it's patronising and irritating, and I think a lot of younger people, particularly in Africa, are sick of it, and sick of the whole kind of charitable flavour of it, and sick of the fact that it kind of gets in the way of them holding their governments to account. And you see what's happening with young people across the world. There's this Generation Z revolts going on. So it's a two-way street, but like all money, money can be spent well and progressively or manipulatively and underminingly. So just talking about the amounts isn't good enough.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we're on the same page, definitely. I mean, I was always a big critic of the 0.7 target because it doesn't talk about how you spend that money. I forget the percentage of the aid budget now that goes on refugees in country, in the UK. So it's a bit of a red herring in terms of the actual amount. What's more important is how it's spent. One of my colleagues, Moki Makura from Africa No Filter, said, the problem with aid is that most Europeans don't want to give it, and many Africans don't want to receive it, actually, at least not on the terms that it comes on. Right now, there are two different conversations that I'm hearing in this space. One is that global majority-led conversation that says we need to free ourselves from aid, generate our own resources, hold our governments to account. And then there's a lot of the INGO sector, BOND, which is the UK Organization of Development Organizations, or Interaction in the US. It's a total disaster. You're just helping China. We've got to spend more money. Please get back to the 0.7. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I believe in mutuality and reparations, even sharing our wealth. And, you know, we've exploited resources from majority world for years and years. But yeah, that cliche, it's also every crisis is an opportunity, which is terrible. Lots of governments have stepped up already and increased their health budgets. There's quite a few. A number are doing domestic resource mobilization in terms of domestic taxes and setting up their own disaster relief funds. I think that shows great potential. It's not going to fill the gaps, not in the short term. But it leaves us with some promise, and the caveat to that would be, how do we get back to holding governments to account at the national level for that change in expenditure and who spends the money and how they spend it?
Kevin.
Well, when I first started working on development, actually just before I met you, we all used to argue for a new international economic order. And the idea of the new international economic order was that North-South relations would be restructured around fairer trade systems, around debt sustainability,
Tax arrangements.
around fairer tax arrangements, about not extracting value from poorer countries and realizing that value in wealthier countries. And I guess the one thing we can say is that we have now got a new international economic order, but it's not quite the one we had in mind.
And it's not very orderly.
And it's not very orderly. So I agree with Claire that, international aid has always had a wildly exaggerated press. On the one side, you had the Make Poverty History campaign, which had this slogan, double aid and halve poverty. Complete nonsense. You could multiply aid 30 times and not halve poverty. An absurd, hubristic claim. On the other side, these are very long-standing debates, and those of you who are doing James's course will know this, that Peter Bauer, actually, who was a professor at the LSE, way back in the 70s, wrote, I thought, a very substantive, well-reasoned critique of international aid from a fairly libertarian perspective. There were people on the left, like Theresa Hayter's book, Aid as Imperialism, that, argued the whole purpose of aid was to reinforce the power of wealthier countries and corporations over the global south. And though the issues that were being raised way back then have been, cutting through these debates on aid over many, many years, like Dambisa Moyo's book, Dead Aid, argued that aid was not only not doing any good, but it was actively doing harm because it was driving up exchange rates. It was giving governments the option of not taxing their own citizens and building a social contract domestically. So, all of those debates are important, and, I guess we'll come back to them. But in the real context that we're living in now, I think there's no other way that you can interpret the cuts in aid as a really significant setback for development, because they're being introduced in a context where many countries, across Africa in particular, but other regions as well, are being forced to cut back health and education spending in order to service debts. We have another debt crisis, which is somehow not on the agenda, but spending from low-income countries on external debt now exceeds their spending on health and primary education. So, that's a serious problem.
They're exporting capital to us.
Yeah. So these aid cuts aren't being introduced in some sort of laboratory experiment where we can work out a better way of doing financing for development. These are cuts. I think you mentioned the Global Fund, James, but Gavi, which is the Global Vaccines Initiative, has had its budget cut by 30%. Now, this is an initiative which, on the basis of scientific evidence, the vaccinations given and lives saved is saving around 1.5 million lives a year. The UK has just cut its budget to Gavi by 25%. And, we could go on and recite these facts. The humanitarian agencies working in Sudan, in Somalia, in other crisis situations, are cutting budgets by 40%. So this is stuff that has real-world consequences. But the wider point I wanted to make, James, and I'll shut up after this, is that I think it's really important when you look at what's happening in aid, that you don't do what Deborah was describing a lot of NGOs are doing, of just standing up and saying people are going to die, or whatever. This tells you something important about what is going on in donor countries. And that is, I believe, a collapse in the public support for aid. The fact that these aid cuts have happened really with very limited response, where you have a political environment in which you have the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, the leader of what I would describe as a neo-fascist party in Reform, Nigel Farage, and the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, standing up and echoing each other in supporting the aid cuts. What does that tell you about our challenges in the UK? And, there are analogues for this in
and
Germany.
And big increases on military spending at the same time.
And by the way, all done, and let's be honest about this, at the behest of an incoming US administration. So the cut in the aid budget from 0.5 to 0.3 was a sop to an incoming Republican administration.
So this kind of gives a segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, and that does this kind of attack on aid or withdrawal of aid, these cuts of this magnitude, is this representative in these times of Donald Trump with the trade wars that have been launched, et cetera, and the weakening of organizations like the WTO, the WHO, et cetera, are we seeing a kind of retreat from multilateralism? And how significant or important is that in terms of the kinds of issues and problems that we're facing on a global scale today?
Well, I'm with Adam Tooze in his big analysis. If there's an article in Foreign Policy and in an interview with him, I recommend strongly that you look at it. he's saying that the aberration was 2015, when the world agreed, and it was all countries in the world, marking the new millennium, agreed to systematically work together to systematically reduce poverty. And indeed, there was some considerable progress from, I think it's 98 to 2023 or something, from a third of the people in the world being in extreme poverty down to 10%. A lot of that is China, but it's not only China, it also happened in lower income countries. So a systematic effort with the governments of the countries agreeing on the objectives, so it's not just the North telling the South what to do, it was a joint project. That was a different mood in the whole world. And it was the same year as the Paris Agreement on climate change. So there was a mood then of kind of progressive mood across the world. That's of course gone completely. And he's saying, well, to put it briefly what he's saying development, if you really mean it, means a lot of poor countries are going to become more powerful. And it will change the whole geopolitics of the world. You know, a powerful Nigeria with the size of its population will be a big player in the international system. And of course, China was successful development. And so then America finds, oh dear, the unipolar moment's over. This is relevant to your multilateralism. You know, China has become much more powerful. We have to deal with it. We might not like it. We might try and stop it developing, but it has, and it's there, and it's real, and it's powerful. So suddenly they're not interested in development. They're interested in their power. And if it could be development within the structure where in the unipolar moment that was one thing, but now it's a vicious, competitive, who can you suppress? And I personally think that the developing world, with the hypocrisy between calling for international law to be upheld in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but making absolutely no steps to require Israel to comply with international law, and it's not just in Gaza, in the whole of the occupied territories. If we'd required Israel to comply with international law, there would have been a settlement and a Palestinian state years ago. So it's pure hypocrisy, and that's felt very deeply in the Global South, as you, I'm sure, know. And so there's a kind of reorientation taking place. And I think the Global South isn't saying we want to be completely controlled by China, but they're saying, look at the China model. A whole continent developed very rapidly. All these Westerners have been telling us what to do for all this time, and, you know, it hasn't gone so well in most places. And I think it's very interesting. It's a reordering of the global geopolitics. China's producing enough renewable energy to fuel the whole of Africa, and it will. I mean, it's churning it out. And of course, having access to power is very important for the development of your economy. I don't think the Global South, therefore, wants to just make a big block with China, but they're more free then to deal with other countries as they wish and as is better for them. And we're moving to a more multilateral thing in a very bad atmosphere with this very angry, dominating United States of America, this pathetic kowtowing Europe, the only person in the world interested in bringing the dreadful war in Ukraine, Russia to an end is the ridiculous Trump, who doesn't know how to do it, but the Europeans seem to want to keep the war going. So we're in a very difficult time, but I think the twos analysis gives us some kind of view of what it all amounts to, and that doesn't mean, for people like you who are hoping to work in development, it doesn't mean that there won't be work in development, but it will be a completely new sort of model. And this is, I mean, the best of this time is the chance to reset and create a better model than the old model. And I think because there will be all sorts of crises and displaced people and humanitarian crises, there will be some move back to provision of some aid to the poorest, and being ready to get that right, and then being clear about countries that aren't devastated, what's the best model for them to achieve their own development. That's going to be the job of your generation, and that's a very good job to have.
Deborah.
Well, I mean, I remember sitting in these seats. It was 30 years ago, but I still remember it. I'm not sure if this theatre was there then. And it was the heyday when you were the Secretary for International Development, when you were writing the Human Development Report. You know, this was great, multilateralism, international cooperation. It was very exciting. But since then, I can see how that was a problem, because we did so much kind of at this international level, and we forgot about connecting people to their local issues. And while
I don't agree with that at all.
okay,
Well, no, budgetary aid and how countries are then in charge of their own development. It wasn't. Anyway.
so.
Go ahead.
So, you know, I work on the concept of subsidiarity, which is as local as possible and as international as necessary. And I think it's, you know, it's one of the saddest things about the aid cuts. We've lost that sense of empathy. I think empathy is dying. But at the same time, there's some positive stuff happening at the civil society level where solidarity is growing. So, at the governance level, it feels like, let's keep the poor people over there, let's contain it, let's make sure those refugees don't make it over here. What's in it for us? Let's get those rare earth minerals or whatever else that we can get out of this system for me. So I think there is that sense of lack of solidarity across boundaries, but there's also this really, a couple of trends that are really giving me hope. I'm seeing growing social movements, the issue that you're working on, coming from the G20, or at least starting with the G20, which I think you'll refer to later, where, you know, I work with movements in Latin America, in Africa. There's something called the Shift the Power movement. There's this group called Acapaca in Latin America, and they're all saying, how do we work together to share common values, but where people have more control over their fates and their democracies?
Is there
yeah.
a role in that for the international NGOs that you have been quite critical about?
Maybe we could talk about that in a bit, about the role. I mean, there is, insofar as mobilizing resources, connecting empathy with their own populations, rebuilding that. We used to have something called the Development Education Association in the UK that got cut. All the NGOs stopped funding it, government stopped funding it, and that built empathy at a very young level for development, and we don't do those sorts of things anymore. And I think NGOs can play some of that role in strengthening the narrative about why we're all in this together. The other thing that gives me a little bit of hope, and maybe we can delve more into that, is there's new models emerging around multilateralism, this idea around global public investment. I don't know if you've come across that. The idea that we should all be investing in a common fund, and we can all be taking out of it things like, you know, pandemics don't know global boundaries. Climate change certainly doesn't. So what are the common things, the common funds we can be investing in? And maybe we need to stop talking about aid as financial flows going from, you know, wealthier countries to the poorer, but actually what's the common, how do we manage the commons, right, on a global basis?
Major financing initiatives
Yeah.
on multilateralism, Kevin.
Well, you know, I think Claire's point is a really important one. Though, you know, when we had the Millennium Development Goals, and then, as you said, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Climate Agreement, it was really framed, you know, as part of this unipolar governance system, and it was a system, you know, in which aid was a really important part. And don't forget, you know, 3/4 of international aid comes from a very small group of Western donors. So, you know, the aid part of it was a Western project. It was led by institutions, the World Bank and the IMF in particular, which are controlled by the West. Like the shareholding structures give almost no voice to China, to India, to emerging markets, but a huge voice to the United States and the European Union. And you know, and I think the challenge that we have in the multilateral system is that we don't have a multilateral. We have a multilateral system that was framed in 1945, actually, and it's been, you know, trying to adapt to a world that is now where change is accelerating and it's moving far too slowly. So, you know, maybe we come back to that discussion, James. But
And the Western powers don't even honour the values that were meant to be in their system.
yeah, but. So then, you know, then I think within that picture there's a broader point, which is there is a collapse in support or you know, the reactionary shift in politics that has happened in much of Europe and the United States has in its target range multilateral approaches and international. You know, the Trump administration clearly sees international cooperation and multilateralism as a straight zero-sum game. You know, if somebody else does well, that's bad for the US. You don't get it framed in quite that stark way on the right in Europe. But you know, these surging populist movements are deeply hostile to multilateralism. They're eroding support for aid. They're eroding support for international institutions. And then, you know, I just wanted to echo Claire's point on this. You know, we have this thing called international humanitarian law, and we have this thing called the rules of war, humanitarian law, the Genocide Convention, and all of that sort of stuff. And you know, these were rules and norms that were framed in like the darkest period of human history, the Second World War, and they've been violated in Gaza, in particular, with absolute impunity for 2 years. Now, you know, you can't have an episode like that and then stand up in other contexts, whether it's Ukraine or Sudan or Venezuela or wherever else, and say, you know, we in the West stand for the rule of law. It just doesn't work. So, you know, I think we need a broader debate about what is the multilateralism for our fragmented, non-unipolar order look like.
If I can just push you collectively a little bit more on this, because you know, when I was writing quite a long time ago about democratic transition in the Philippines, so I wrote something called The Survival of an Imperfect Democracy, because it's a very elite democracy, it's very unequal, etc. But the idea of having a democratic constitution created the ability to make claims against it. So social movements could work to make claims. And when we think about international law, it's been very imperfect. It's been very embryonic. It's violated all the time. Israel is the worst example of the way every single resolution and some of the pillars of international law have just been violated. We see the cynicism of the big powers, you know, vis-a-vis this. But what if we we don't have that terrain for claim making? That you know, that kind of
counterfactual.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, I think the Global South is worried about this. I mean, in the sense, it's the weaker people that need law and rules.
Yeah.
You know, big bully America can do what it likes. But if you're a small country, you want to be in an international order where there's some rules and, you know, if everyone... So I think that's one of the things that's pulling this Global South different perspective. And there is a multilateral order being built.
Yeah.
It's untidy and unclear where it's all ending up. But it's changing. And the truth is, we're not in the unipolar moment anymore.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing, but we're in a period of chaos and danger and cruelty, and this populist right is also deeply racist. Yeah. And I mean, that's not only just wrong, it's so dangerous for the whole world, you know, what should we all do, hate each other, and then how, you know, and we're facing this ecological crisis that affects all of us. It's stupid as well as nasty. So we're in a dangerous time, but there are some forces at work. The Global South standing for itself. I'm with those international NGOs. They tried to take all the aid budget and be in charge of it. They got way out of control. They irritated me when I was in government. I know I didn't give them much money, but they gradually got more and more money because they used to get MPs to come and see me and wanted the money, and I wanted to give it directly to the countries anyway. So I agree with that. But of course, and often they then gave money to civil society in the Global South and then tried to control what it said. Whereas a real voices of the people, and we are getting that with the Generation Z protests. Mm. And of course, when you look at the population projections and the age profile across Africa, it's going to be a transformation. That generation is not going to put up with what's been going on. I don't know how it will go, So these are exciting things, possibilities. So it's dangerous, there's a lot of nastiness, but there is something exciting as well, challenging what was just not acceptable about the old order.
Thanks. Either want to come back on this?
I mean, there were some challenges with some of those rules. The international humanitarian law was a big barrier in Ukraine to local civil society getting any of the funding because, you know, they wanted to feed their men at war and they weren't allowed to because international humanitarian law treats perpetrators the same as the victims. So we do need those international laws, but they need to be rewritten for today's times, right? So that's...
Well, like genocide is wrong, I don't think we need to rewrite that. We need to implement it.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And of course, you're not
I don't
allowed
disagree
to
with that.
take territory by force. That's one of the founding ideas of the United Nations.
Yes.
1967 occupation. And that's, of course, the law that Russia has broken in invading Ukraine. Even though they were provoked, it's not acceptable, but we need to bring that war to an end. So there are some of the foundational principles of international law that are absolutely precious and we must hold on to and get back to and stand up for.
Yeah, I think one of the big characteristics of our time, Donald Trump and right populist politics, is to kind of deny law. You know, you appeal to a law when it serves your interests, and otherwise, you just run roughshod over the law, whether it's in the domestic arena or in the international arena.
Well, I don't want to speak too much, but if you take the vote at the UN on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, almost all countries voted that it was wrong. But then when America, supported by Europe, wanted to have sanctions and all that, most countries in the global south didn't agree. So they were holding on to the principle of the law, but not the hypocrisy. And that, I think that was quite a sophisticated position.
Kevin.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here.
Yes.
Look, on humanitarian law, I disagree a bit with Deborah on this one. That, you know, if you look at the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention, they're emphatically clear on a bunch of things. And of course, interpretation in conflict is always difficult in implementation of law. But, you know, these basic ideas that you don't bomb hospitals, you don't bomb schools, the key principle of proportionality, you know, clearly what has happened in Gaza is so far removed from any plausible interpretation of proportionality that, you know, and to me, that conflict alone has raised really fundamental questions about how do you restore the credibility of international law. But it's not just Gaza, actually, because, you know, if you look at the proceedings of, say, the UN Human Rights Committee, you know, which have done investigations looking at the West Bank, Ethiopia and Tigray, many other cases, voting in those fora happens purely on foreign policy lines. You know, it's not as though there's some sort of adjudication process going on about, you know, who's upholding law and who's violating it. So it was already a debased currency. I think it's now a totally broken system, and you know, there's a challenge about how do you rebuild it. On the international NGOs, I'm really going to hesitate on this, but look, I do take the point, and so I think there's a very real sense in which big international NGOs, and actually especially in the UK, because, you know, I think the influence of international NGOs has been stronger in the UK than most other cases. It's sort of got out of control, and it evolved into a sort of model, you know, where you would pitch up to the G7, make demands, try and get the G7 to agree something, and then you think you change the world. And the world doesn't change because of the G7 or the G20. It changes, you know, through social movements in developing countries. But on the other side, there are so many examples of INGOs doing something better than that. You know, I can think of illustrations of, say, where in Oxfam, where it's supported an organization called the Action for Economic Research in the Philippines, which was it was a financing partnership. They had their agenda, they did what they want. This was the organization that negotiated the sin tax in the Philippines, which led to the creation de facto of a national health service. Now, that was an NGO using public funds from a rich country to act in solidarity with a social movement in a poor country. And there are many other examples of that across Latin America, across Africa. Now, there are plenty of examples of the other stuff as well. For example, 20% of international humanitarian aid goes through international non-government organizations. Between 1 and 2% goes through local NGOs in conflict-affected countries. I mean, that is just indefensible. That's some sort of collusive relationship between major aid donors and international NGOs. And it's wrong, and it's an abuse of a power relationship.
But could we make the distinction? They got so greedy and they went for massive budgets, and budgets that should have gone, in my view, through budgetary aid to governments to build their own systems. Then they're coming as controlling forces. Now, to go back to organisations that do the analysis, do solidarity, raise a bit of money, meet with others across the world, of course we need that. We need human beings to meet each other and understand each other's issues and share. But that's not these big budget, powerful, controlling. That's what went wrong.
I think there's probably a lot to say, and maybe we'll do it with the wider Q&A, about the different ways in which aid has been, and what do we learn from it, from the past. Because the point that Clare is raising is really crucial, the extent to which transfers of funds from the north to the south actually reinforce the possibilities for development or undermine them.
Yeah.
There's so much money going outside of state systems, going directly to this or that, organization and society, creating alternative kind of sites of competition, political competition over access to
But
those
further
resources.
weakening a weak state.
Yeah, weakening the weak state. And I think that's been really crucial on the one hand. The other hand, in terms of delivery mechanisms, it has to do with, something you were saying about the Philippines just now. I know the case very well as a fight around the sin taxes and the healthcare system. The interesting lesson there is that it was not the aid donors, not Oxfam, not the international NGOs who came up with the ideas. These were popular social movements fighting, who then looked for some support for what they were doing. So that dynamic has been absolutely crucial. I think it's ever since the beginning of aid programs, is this, emerging are the projects, the program, the demands, et cetera, for research, emerging from communities or being, offered from the outside.
There's a couple of things. I think you need to make a distinction between the service delivery model of INGOs versus those who do a lot of good work on advocacy. I think Oxfam's done a good job on inequality, for example. But Save the Children, for example, their humanitarian budget, something like 90% of it they're basically subcontractors to government. They're competing with the private sector to do service delivery. And at the local level, civil society would say, hey, we can do that. Go away, we don't need you to do service delivery. But on a solidaristic level, they do want to collaborate. And we're actually, in the INGO project, we're doing something, and it sounds really simple on paper, called a reverse call for proposals. Because there's still very much that donors dictate. If you're I don't think this happens at the LSE, but I know at Manchester and several other universities, if you study development, you learn how to do a log frame, right? Apparently, you can draw a linear equation between a bit of money in and an outcome out. Not possible. Not a fan of log frames. But donors still require this project-based type of funding that needs to have the INGO kind of in control, or they perceive that they need to be in control. And on this idea of a reverse call for proposals, we're working with local communities for them to say, what is it they want and need from the international sector? And that could include donors as well as INGOs. And we're coming up with very different things. Some of it is support in kind, maybe legal support, for example, or can you teach us how to do our own fundraising, please? Can you help invest in a country-level pooled fund that we can draw on? There's lots of things that are emerging from this, but the systems at the INGO level, at the funder level, are not set up to respond to what people's demands and needs are at the local level. And I know you believe that most of the funding should go through governments.
Well, I think in very poor countries with weak systems, it should be done in a way that helps them strengthen their systems, not
But you
undermine it.
also need a stronger, and this is where the international civil society sector comes in, INGOs, you need to hold those governments to account.
Of
you
course
need
you
strong
do, but
civil society
for
to
example,
do
in
that.
the ITI, which is about transparency in extractive industries, there was civil society on the boards in all the countries, but the northern NGOs controlled those civil societies. And actually, if they'd been really reflective of their country and really scrutinising the figures and how the money was
I
being
wrote an
spent, they would have
evaluation.
been much more powerful. Well,
I'm saying that very thing. I wrote an evaluation of the ITI.
so
So I think, I think this is actually a good point where we turn to the audience, to our students. And I'm very happy we've gotten into some of these debates, because these are the thorny issues that are related to, how do we move forward. We have students here from IDHE. How many are from IDHE? Yeah, International Development and Humanitarian Emergencies Program. Development Management, we have people from Development Management here. Development Studies, yeah, big group. Health and International Development. So from all the EPID, economic policies and international development, somebody maybe. So we have students who are trying to understand the process of development from these very different perspectives. And this topic is important to all of you. So let's engage the speakers with some of your difficult searching questions. Okay. Can I have a little view of where the questions are? Some here.
don't forget upstairs.
Some up there, and some up. Okay, so I've been asked, because I have this tendency when I chair these discussions to make those with microphones run all around. So I'm going to actually go from this section to this section to that section to this section, and then we'll come around again. Yes? So, where's the microphone down here? Okay, good. So just behind you, we have somebody.
Thank you very much. I'm Marco. I'm
Is that-
It's not working.
Puedo escuchar.
It's very
Just
directional.
talk right
Sorry.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm Marco. I'm a development student at development studies at the master level. So my question to you is with the UK planning to reduce the further spending from the 0.5 to 0.3% of GNI to fund the increased defense commitment. I mean, it was announced in February this year. How do you see this reshaping the UK's global development role? And then this is basically the 5 years since the DFID has dissolved as a separate entity, and we all know that once it was a hallmark of an independent principal approach to poverty reduction in the world, and it was distinct at that time from foreign and defense policy. So given the current policy direction, do you think such separation is still possible and even desirable having in mind the current geopolitical circumstances?
Okay, thank you. I think what I'm going to do is take a few questions, right? Do you have somebody else over here, did I see? Yes. Could you just pass it back, row by row? You can just pass it through the students, rather than innocent running. Okay, very good.
Thank you all for your time. The question that I have, I think, applies a little bit to the debate that was just happening, which is you've talked about social movements that are occurring in the global south and sort of these desires for more involvement in democracy and in governing their own countries. And at the same time, development itself takes a lot of coordination. So, and democracy is often very uncoordinated and can be inefficient. And so how would you propose combining the principles of democracy and participation with a coordinated approach to development, especially one that spans different administrations or different parties in power?
So, development needs cooperation, but democracy is messy.
As in
Can
the
you
US
pass
at
that
the
down
moment.
this way? And then I'm going to go, in the meantime, up there. Who do you guys see just on this side? Yeah.
Hi. Hi, my name is Priyanka. I'm a development studies student and was also formerly working in USAID.
Speak a bit louder.
Yeah.
Slower.
Yeah? Sorry. I was also formerly working in USAID contracting, so this is really interesting. This is a bit of a general question, but I know it was mentioned earlier that the Global South might become a larger player in development. So I was wondering, what are some ways that tactics can be adopted so that there is less of a top-down, soft power approach that USAID had, and how development could look differently kind of in this new era?
Did you get that?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I'm going to take one more question over here. Where's the mic downstairs here? Pass it this way. Just down here in front. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to ask a question where you touched on, for example, on the Ukraine aid that's going on. Of course, the reality is that we want to help as many countries as possible, but we know that's not realistic. When you mention Ukraine, though, I would say that there probably should be slightly more priority to Ukraine above other nations, because when we're providing aid to Ukraine, I would say we're doing that from a strategic standpoint, where, yes, we're defending Ukraine from Russia, but we're also indirectly defending the United Kingdom and the EU from Russia, because we're within geographical parameters of Ukraine. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that as well.
Okay, I'm going to go to our speakers now for our first set of responses. The more we're concise, the more we go through other questions. But let's change
Well, the first one, the effects of the
Okay.
UK cuts. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
And
You start.
the abolition of the FID. I think we now have a government, and shockingly a Labour government, who doesn't care much about poverty in the UK, shockingly. You know, this getting rid of the two-child benefit cap would reduce... We've got hungry children in this country,
Yeah.
and they haven't prioritised that, even though they've increased a lot of spending on defence, as they call it, which is becoming more aggressive military spending. And the abolition of the FID goes with that. I mean, just downgrading the whole effort. So the UK's reputation in development is much diminished, and its influence is much diminished. I think there'll come another time, but that's where we are. And it's as simple as that. Social movements and their power, but development takes coordination. There isn't any country that doesn't have a government. Most social movements want their government to change. So it isn't that you need the development people from outside to coordinate. You need the social movements to demand their space and demand change from their government. And then, ideally, they have some solidarity from international systems to build the strength of the systems in their country that will enable them to achieve what they want. So the next question was how tactics can be less top-down. And I go to the same point, and it's your point as well. If social movements are respected, they voice what they want the country to be, and international organisations and so on should reinforce support for those values. I mean, you can't be political and interfere in a country, but you can say, I mean, what are they demanding? Basic healthcare or something? I mean, that should be a priority of the whole UN and World Bank system and so on. So I don't think it is that top-down in most countries, but the thinking of the system has been very top-down. And I mean, I want to say to you really clearly, I've said it before, but this is a very bad time and things are destroyed. But for you, it's also a very exciting time, because everything's going to be remade. And learning the lessons of before and making it better in the future is your job. On Ukraine, I completely and profoundly disagree with you. One, I disagree that Russia is going to invade the rest of Europe. I think that is a piece of complete and absolute nonsense. If it takes them all this time to have a war with Ukraine, of course, fully supported by NATO, it's nonsense that it's going to attack. I think that if Europe wants to support Ukraine a lot, they should, but not at the expense of the monies that they've made available for the poorest people in the world. Should they pay? They've increased defence spending enormously.
Yeah.
They don't need to cut aid to do that. That is a policy decision. They said, the focus group showed that people supported it. So don't get caught in that. because you value something, it doesn't mean you have to cut the money for the poorest people. I mean, actually, aid budgets are tiny compared with military budgets. So never get caught in that trap.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Kevin.
Well, on the first question, if I could use a football analogy. So the UK, in the space of 2 years, has gone from 3rd place in the OECD league table of generosity to 25th place. And the football analogy is that only Manchester United has had a far more rapid descent than the UK's standing. So apologies to any Manchester United supporters in the audience. But, you know, but the serious point in this is that these changes do have reputational consequences for a country standing on the international stage. And to justify the change from 0.5 to 0.3 by reference to defence needs, as Clare said, is ridiculous. Like, you know, if you believe that, you could have argued, for example, that if you believe we now face a national defence emergency, then introduce a national patriotic tax levy to fund the response. You know, tax billionaire wealth, tax property, whatever. Don't do it by cutting vaccination programs, HIV/AIDS programs. I mean, that's really damaging. But it comes back to this point that, you know, if you're trying to support international development, but you have a tax policy in a domestic political environment that's pulling you in completely the other direction, this is where you end up. On the, you know, look, I mean, democracy, of course, it's messy, but I go back to the point that I think international NGOs at their best act in solidarity, and the way to act in solidarity is to work with organisations and to follow the lead of organisations that are trying to advance progressive change. Now, you know, that can be through trying to hold governments to account through transparency. It can be through research and analysis. It can be through programs like, you know, one of the programs in Save the Children that we supported was doctors across Africa who were trying to get health systems to focus more on childhood pneumonia, like the main killer of children in Africa, which has zero visibility on the health agendas of many governments across the region because it's the poorest kids. Now, that's an equity issue. But, you know, we could all give our favourite examples, but, you know, I think that's the way you support democracy and the way you support change. But finally, on a really quick point, on this top-down question, I'm working at the moment with the Brazilian government on this thing called the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. And we've been looking at the aid programs relating to hunger and poverty across a broad group of countries. Now, the government of Ethiopia, to give you just one example, just on health and social protection, currently produces 245 reports every year to donor agencies.
Ridiculous.
245. Now, if that money, as Clare was suggesting earlier, went through the national budget, you would cut out this nonsense.
Yeah.
And the difficulty at the moment is that the aid environment is so fragmented, it's so crowded, with agencies that have got overlapping remits, each one of which wants to put their flag on the project. And INGOs as well, you know, are part of this picture. But we sort of need to move away from that, you know, highly fragmented picture to something that's, you know, more coherent and supportive of national capacity.
So let me refer to two of these ones. So funnily enough, just following on from that, USAID, where's the USAID person? Hello. Pockets of USAID were actually incredibly innovative on this. There was, Samantha Power had a target to get 30% of the civil society funding direct to local organizations and cut the bureaucracy. We did an experiment with USAID with a group in the Philippines, Center for Disaster Preparedness, James may know them, where we had 50 points of reporting just to get a grant of 50,000 USD, and we cut it down to 1. by cutting out all these bits in the middle and realizing actually it wasn't proportionate or necessary. And there's, you know, it sounds really nerdy and small potatoes, but actually you add that up across the aid system and you can cut costs quite a lot and actually really support local actors significantly. And the donors have to get rid of their bureaucracy. And as you say, everyone in that supply chain of aid, from the donor to the intermediary to the next intermediary to the local national organization, right down, all adds their little points that they need to do. Which brings me on to democracy. I don't think democracy is that inefficient. It's a higher upfront investment, but actually, if you align people, there's some really great experiments out there around deliberative democracy. We do a lot of work in participatory grant making, where community level decides how they're going to spend the money. It takes a lot of upfront time because you don't know the outcome. But once they're aligned and they go. They coordinate. Their values are on the same page. So I don't think coordination and democracy are mutually exclusive. It's just where do we invest the time, at the beginning or at the end?
Okay, thanks. I want to go back to the audience and take some more questions.
There's
Can
a
I see
woman up
hands
there.
again so I can? Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll start up in this corner here, with these.
Thank you. I have a question about the role of the private sector and specifically consultancies as growing recipients of development aid money and contracts. And I'm specifically thinking about this in light of the Tony Blair Institute being tasked with coming up with a plan for the reconstruction of Gaza, but also Keir Starmer opening up a field for private companies to compete for contracts for the rebuilding of Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Hold on a second. So just here.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. As I think another questioner noted, it's been just over 5 years since the dissolution of DFID. What could and should DFID have done differently to justify itself? Was it a failure of narrative or something else? And what lessons can we take from that moving forward, given the shrinking aid budgets we're seeing around the world today?
Shall we go here? Yeah, I'm going to do this in kind of, it's block voting, as it were. Yeah.
You've talked a lot about priorities and what should and shouldn't be prioritized with aid funding. Claire, I apologize if I'm misquoting, but you rather infamously commented on Montserrat when they asked for more aid that they'd be asking for golden elephants next. How in the modern age are we meant to decide what deserves the limited humanitarian funding that we have, and when we are attributing too much, when there are so many crises that are so deserving?
Okay, thank you very much. I think we should come back down here. Where's the microphone down here? Who has it? Oh, very good. Just pass it behind you, I think. First.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
How can aid for development be positioned as a tool for poverty reduction rather than strategic leverage and influence?
Okay, that's short and sweet and to the point. Yeah, I'm just behind you, and then we'll come back to the speakers.
Yeah.
Well, I think you all partially answered this question through your answers, but I wanted to ask directly because there's lots of discourses on like localization and how it's
Localization.
Yes. So I wanted to, but there's less consensus on how like the technical aspects of what localization really looks like. So I wanted to ask what localization means for each of you, and relatedly, I think it was Hillary Clinton maybe when she came to Europe for some event, she mentioned that yes, giving power, like making development pure and empowering the developing countries and the organizations there matters, but removing the strings might actually undermine the ability to mobilize resources for development en masse. So what are your views on that kind of approach, that there's some sort of tension between like pure development and like being able to mobilize resources for development?
Okay.
Very interested.
All right. So I'm going to start this time with Kevin.
Okay, I think I'm going to leave Tony Blair to Claire. I mean, if, look, the Tony Blair stuff is so ridiculous. We shouldn't be spending time. It's outrageous and absurd. But I'll leave that, as I say, I'll leave that to Claire. On localization, maybe I'll start with localization. Look, I'll just give you a practical example of what good localization could look like. In Somalia, which is a country which every year is the subject of a humanitarian appeal. And the way humanitarian appeals work is that UN agencies do a cost estimate for what they think the country is going to need. It then typically gets funded at half of that level or less. And then all of the money goes through the World Food Programme and big international NGOs, basically. Now, in Somalia, you have a network of humanitarian agencies, local agencies, organised in something called the Somalia Humanitarian Network. And many of those agencies are more than on a par with northern counterparts and more than on a par with UN agencies. And they're also deeply connected to local communities, and they have insights which outside actors don't have. And yet, the organisations in that federation account for less than 1% of the humanitarian aid that goes into Somalia. That's not only inequitable in a really profound way, it's grossly inefficient because they would do it way more effectively. So, I think a more efficient system would basically be using agencies that are on the ground. There are all sorts of reasons it doesn't happen, which, James, I don't think we have time to go into now. But, often it's the auditing requirements of the donor agencies that make it very difficult. In some cases, it's the failure of international NGOs to subcontract in ways that are fair and so on. So there are a lot of barriers. On the subject of prioritisation, the only thing I'll say is this: that I can't remember who raised it now, but there was this the question of should we focus on poverty, should we focus on hunger, how do we decide? And there are never easy answers to these questions. And in general, I would be a strong supporter of finance going through national budgets, because that's the most efficient way to build systems that can reach poor and vulnerable people. But it's also the case that many governments don't prioritise that goal. And NGOs can play a role in supporting actors who are trying to prioritise that goal. Now, this is non-binary territory, because the consequence of going outside a government system is that you've got a complex interaction between an international player that's raising money from the public in the north and local actors. There are inefficiencies that will come with that as well. You have to balance the issue of, what leverage do you have to effect change in a country? So, I don't think there are straightforward answers to any of these questions, and this is just the reality of the environment in which real development, actually happens. What did DFID do wrong? Claire's going to have views on this as well. The one thing I would say about, that I was part of the NGO community that for a long time argued for 0.7, and it became almost an emblematic thing. We had Live Aid, and then we had Live Aid, and then we had 2005 Glen Eagles, and there were thousands of people, and then we got it enshrined in international legislation. And then we had David Cameron and George Osborne, of all people, in the Conservative Party saying, this was going to also be the emblem of a softer, kinder conservatism. And then that government did stuff in the welfare system in the UK that increased child poverty at rates that were unprecedented. And the NGO community said nothing about that. We all focused, or there was a lot of focus on 0.7. So I think one lesson of this is, don't be an advocate for poverty reduction and justice and equity overseas when you turn your back on poverty and justice and equity in your own country. And I'm overstating it a little bit, but I think what opened the door to this extreme right-wing reaction and made aid such an easy target was precisely that failure. So that, that is one of the lessons I would draw.
Okay.
Should we go to Clare next?
No, we'll go to you.
Me? Oh, but so I'm going to do that classic media thing where I don't answer the questions. But I want to talk about the private sector in aid. I think that's I'll leave the politics to the politicians here. So I do think we need to be concerned about a growing share of the aid budget going to the private sector. I think there's a big role for social enterprises, which doesn't come out. I think there could be some innovation in that space. But one of the things we're also seeing, I gave some evidence a few months ago to the International Development Select Committee. They're all looking at not just the private sector for delivery, but the philanthropy to fund aid, to fill in the gaps, even though the figures that come out of philanthropy just absolutely dwarf what could come out of the aid budget, or debt relief for that matter. But there's a growing kind of importance of philanthropy and private sector funding, things like the Bezos Earth Fund coming in with the equivalent in funding of Norway and Sweden, as their budgets, 10 billion or something like that. And the problem with that privatization around aid is they also demand things that help them as a private sector actor. It's not necessarily in the public interest for those countries that they're trying to serve, either be it in the area of climate change or health or whatever else. And I've got issues with the Gavi alliance, but maybe this isn't the place to debate it. That it's private sector led and it's their model. Yes, there are governments involved, but there are some critiques of that from a public health perspective. So I do think this creeping romanticization, one of my colleagues calls it philanthropy, and reliance on the private sector to do what is essentially public good is highly problematic. And I'll just talk about that one and leave it to Clare to do the rest.
Clare.
Well, firstly, I'm very pessimistic about this deal on Gaza. It's not going to lead to, already they can't find all the bodies of the people who've died, and of course there's lots and lots of Palestinians under the rubble. But now Israel is threatening to cut off humanitarian aid if they don't deliver the bodies, and Turkey said they'd come in with machinery and help to find them, and they won't let Turkey in. So already you can see that it's deeply problematic. And of course, appointing Blair to be a sort of imperial ruler in Gaza is highly objectionable. But I kind of doubt that we'll get there. But it shows that it's all run by Trump, and Blair could get in with Kushner, and they could say, we'll have Blair, and this is, we've just recognised the right for the Palestinians to have a state. Well, what happened to that if Blair's going to be in charge of the reconstruction of Gaza? So one, it's profoundly objectionable. Two, it comes through Trump and the connections there and Blair's connections with them. And three, I think it isn't going to happen. On the contracting, the trouble is that they're not only doing it in international development, they're doing it to the public sector in our countries. It's part of neoliberalism. Minimise the state, do everything through the private sector. And they're doing it systematically here and now. And you see the growth of inequality and companies making lots of money out of public sector provision. I was thinking about the China model. It really is authoritarian Keynesianism. I know it's called the Communist Party, but it's not. It's capitalism, right? But it's with a powerful state, whereas we're running down our states in our countries and then saying to countries with very weak state capacity, they should just rely on the private sector, and we're just weakening their states even more. So it's worse than you think. It's not just in international development that it's happening. I agree completely. DFID, we used to do work about what people in Britain thought of DFID, and when they knew that lots of girls were going to school because of the work that was being done, the public really liked it. If you keep announcing lumps of money, the public thinks, well, don't we need that money? So people have good hearts if you talk about real human beings and real sort of progress that they've... But then I agree, the NGOs became absolutely fixated on getting to 0.7. They eventually got it at a time when under the Cameron-Osborne thing, all the British public services were being cut and cut and cut. Yes, child poverty went up, but everything got cut very badly, and aid was going up. Well, this is a ridiculous politics. You're going to lose people for believing in development if you're screwing them at home. And then, so because that was happening and it was causing anger, they used the aid budget to give money to all sorts of different departments, the health, home office, and it became more and more inefficient and less focused on poverty and building the strength of countries. So it became, the money both lost the public and it actually lost the effectiveness of the, so it was a disaster. And then we got a government that doesn't care about poverty at home or internationally. On Montserrat and Golden Elephants, there's no doubt I got a bad press on this, but there was a volcano in Montserrat, which is a British dependent territory, and we were rebuilding houses and doing stuff like that because people's houses had been destroyed. And the chief minister at the time, who was later exposed as a child abuser, apart from other things, was demanding the building of a prison. No, he was. I mean, you can look it all up. And that was the thing that was really annoying me. We needed to focus on the needs of the people, not his control of the population. And I was talking about him to Patrick Wintour, who screwed me. He used to work for The Guardian. Actually, he's still The Guardian's international diplomatic editor, or whatever they call it. And so they said, you know, that, and they, as though I was saying that about all the people of Montserrat. But I was vindicated in the end by the exposure of the man in question. Now, in your question, how can aid be used for poverty reduction? It's a matter of will and structures. We were using it when we had the model of going through countries' budgets and absolutely getting agreement with the local government and so on, that was the point, get all children to school, get everybody vaccinated, build those capacities in the country. Then you're not interfering in, I mean, the government has to sign up to that to get into the project, and then the local civil society can hold them to it. So that's what we were doing, but northern governments, including the UK government, didn't like budgetary aid. They want to have it so that they give it to someone, you know, and put a Union Jack on it, and they've got all sorts of ulterior motives. That's one of the things. There's been ulterior motives around aid forever, and you have to look for a model where those are diminished, and you focus on the real issues, which is this consistent reduction of poverty, and therefore the growth of the capacity of the countries, especially the poorest countries. Because, of course, you need different approaches when you get to a middle-income country with some poverty within it, but if we're talking about the poorest. Localisation, I agree very much with. It's most important on humanitarian aid. And, you know, we've got this white saviour. You get a crisis, there's a famine, and then in comes the international system with lots of very well-meaning young white people from the north. And there's all sorts of really intelligent, capable people who understand the needs of their country who are not employed. And it's just not acceptable. But as Kevin has said, getting it changed, I mean, we've been saying that clearly now for quite some time, but getting them to change, because it's all this bureaucracy and accountability and having to fill up the paperwork, that's the problem. But localisation on humanitarian crises is a really profoundly good idea, as Kevin said, and we must stick with it and push it.
It's not just humanitarian, it's the development sector as well. Localization, I should have come at this earlier, is decolonization. It's about people having a say over their development priorities. And there are ways and means to do that.
It depends what you mean by it, because if you then cut out governments and go for local projects, you're back into the other problem.
Quite the opposite, actually. I don't mean that at all. But it's not about an INGO coming in and saying, we're going to deliver your services. It's about that relationship between a national government and its people. That's localization. And what we're seeing in the localization front, and the way INGOs have been defining it, is it means, we'll set up a national country office and we'll raise money from the local people, which actually excludes local actors from raising their own funds and growing their own organizations. So I think it has to be a holistic approach to think local leadership, locally led, and that concept of subsidiarity that I said before, as international as necessary, as local as possible.
But in the humanitarian sector, we could get a lot of change, and we need to really drive that. It's one of the issues for your generation's reforms.
Right. Very good. I'm going to go back to the audience for questions. Can I see again hands? I see here and there. I did a lot with you on this side. The middle gets lost in this new formula. How about upstairs? Where are we at?
And people at the back, look.
Over
Yeah,
here.
people
Yeah,
at the back.
let me go to a couple. I'm going to go to a couple of colleagues actually.
No,
Here.
not.
Laura, and then that colleague back there.
Thank you very much. So, as a daughter of a Man United fan, lifetime
I
fan,
apologize.
I'm kind of interested in like how we claw back from, what was it, 25 to third, and particularly, let's say hypothetically, somebody used to believe in the Labour Party in this country. How do young people today politically connect with raising that league table rating? Where are the political entry points within this current political context, particularly in the UK? Is there any point engaging with the Labour Party? Is there any point engaging with the Green Party? What should be the way for young people who are thinking maybe, you know, about their future in development being a political role? What should they be thinking about?
Thanks, Laura. And then let's go to Duncan in the back.
Thanks, everybody. Always entertaining. Thanks, Claire. There was a long-term sort of existential challenge even before the crisis, which was as countries grow and develop, all the ones with effective states cease to be dependent on aid, and the aid kind of focuses on the places where it's hardest to get anything done. So, and that's only going to carry on now. So states where the governments are predatory or completely ineffective, where civil society is weak or has no purchase on government. So it feels like it's been corralled into a place where it's really hard to get results. Do you think that there's any alternative to that? If you're going where the poverty is, that's where the poverty is going to be in 20, 30 years' time, in what we used to call fragile, conflict-affected states. It just seems really a big challenge for the aid sector.
Yeah, that's long been an issue, I think, that we should address. If you look at Rwanda, you know, it can weather the aid cuts because it's been building up its own fiscal capacity to do things. Up here, yeah, on top.
Hi, my name is Khatija. I'm from Pakistan, and I had a question related to. I'm here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'm looking down here.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I actually wanted to ask a little bit of a follow-up on the localization point. I don't know if a lot of you know this, but polio is a really big problem even to date in Pakistan, and we had almost eradicated it before the Bin Laden raids. And one of the issues that happened after Bin Laden was caught was that the polio workers were no longer trusted because the US government NCIA used polio workers to spy on the neighborhood. So I actually wanted to ask how in this geopolitical system, how local actors who are basically cleaning the mess right now can cooperate with international organizations when the ground reality is so tough and it's consistently getting tough.
I think that's an important question, not least because the U.S. Secretary of Health is sort of campaigning against vaccinations now. So
yes,
we see polio also reemerging, perhaps in the United States. There was a question here in the middle. You've been raising your hand for a long time. If you can pass the mic down there.
Yes, thank you. We haven't really spoken about regional development banks because I think the IMF and the World Bank, they've done some quite interesting things, but especially talking about like multilateralism and being closer to the communities that you actually want to serve. I was wondering, would there be a bigger role for regional development banks in the future of development aid?
So the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank.
The Inter-American Development
Caribbean.
Bank, these kinds.
Yeah.
Caribbean's a small one, but people don't look at it. Yeah.
Okay, why don't we take up those four? And Claire, do you want to start this time?
Wait, this,
Okay, Deborah. you
Sorry,
start.
oh, Clare,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Start.
Go ahead, Deborah.
Well,
You
I'll start with what to do about the
Okay.
Labour Party. I've left
Yes.
it. I've left it personally. After years of being an MP for the Labour Party and in the cabinet. But I'm not saying everyone should leave. I think some of the brave people who stay and try to get it back to what it used to be are heroic and should be supported. But people also should vote tactically now. You have to look at where you're living and who the candidates are and so on. I mean, the Green Party is coming up very strongly. Zach Balansky is saying the right things. Labour has thought that reform is its threat. You know, the Farage, racist, populist. But actually, Labour's losing votes to the Lib Dems and the Greens and staying at home. So I think that's going to become more powerful. Well, the next big elections here in May next year, all the big cities and Wales and Scotland. And if Labour does as badly as they did in the last local elections, there's going to be a lot of turbulence in the party and demand for change. So we'll see. Then we need those good people to stay in and get the kind of change that's needed. But it is shocking, shockingly terrible what's going on. Duncan. Actually, Rwanda's a good example. When we first went to Rwanda, it had been completely wrecked by the genocide and the destruction of all its systems. And we did our budgetary aid rebuilding the systems. And it provides effective healthcare and education. It's very authoritarian. I mean, British NGOs don't like it. But I consider Rwanda to be a big success story. It doesn't mean everything's perfect. Who's got a perfect government? Certainly not here, certainly not in America, da-da-da. But, they, from where they were. So I don't think we've ever really tried to take on a fragile state, because we tend then to just provide humanitarian aid and not try to rebuild institutions in the country. I think, so it's difficult, I agree, but I don't think the effort has been well directed or challenging enough. And if we just look at Rwanda as an example, there may be others. I was very involved in the Rwanda thing. It's doable. And it's going to get worse, I agree with you. And we've got to be better at ending conflict. Because, of course, if there's a conflict going on, then you just have to keep people alive, but you can't rebuild anything. And the international system has become less adequate at that. And this is where the crisis of the poorest is going to be, and the biggest challenge of the future, I agree with you. And I don't think the effort that's been made has been very thought through. It's tend to leave it to the humanitarians and do a few projects. So it's a bigger thing to talk about. But we did it in Rwanda, whether you like Kagame or not. Yes, the problem of polio vaccination also was a problem in northern Nigeria. Sort of populist, local Muslim movements saying, these are white people trying to interfere and diminish us. I think the only way to go is to work with those brave local people to ask them what's the best way to do it, and not be the face of it, outsiders, but support them in... I know people have lost their lives trying to do it, so this is not an easy challenge. It's the same in northern Nigeria. And I mean, I'm sure there's some public education in it, because parents don't want their kids to get polio, but of course they're misinformed. But I think the only answer is to talk with the locals, find the best way of communicating, listen to them. And as James said, it's not helped by America now saying that polio causes, vaccination causes autism and so on. The regional development banks, they've been weak and not well funded. But I think if you take the Africa Development Bank, which in our time was kind of collapsing. It's not now. It's a much stronger institution, and the African Union is a much stronger institution, and it's Africa's own development bank. And I think, where are you who said this? Yes, I think this is going to be more important and good, because then it's the region taking care of itself and having its own leadership. So I think we'll hear more of it. There's one in the Caribbean too, which we never hear about, but is significant. And of course, South America. So I think it's a very important point. I think they're important institutions. I think they've got stronger in the last 10 years or so, and I think we'll hear more about them, and especially as there's more criticism of the World Bank and the imbalance in, who controls those institutions, like the UN, which is going to become, with the rise of the global south and its more assertiveness, it's going to be more assertive about that in the World Bank and in the UN Security Council, and the obvious logic is to build up their own development banks. I mean, like Britain would be a member of the board of the Africa Development Bank, but in a minority, which is as it should be. So no, I think you make a very important point. And if you're looking for the careers, that's a place for some of you to look, I think.
Deborah, go ahead.
Politics. I think young people, all of us, old people as well, should be working at your community level to build empathy and understanding across different parts of society. And I think we think of politics as only happening in a political party. But I think it's bottom up. I think it's reconnecting with communities where there are divides and trying to find common cause. I think that's one of the most important things we can all be doing. At the political level, I'm a member of the Green Party. So there you go. That's what I'll say.
But you can use your vote to punish governments. So that shouldn't be ruled out. I agree.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
And that's will be coming.
And also work on electoral reform, proportional representation is another place to put some of your time and make a bit more noise about.
Yeah.
I wanted to come to the localization question. I just want to echo what Claire was saying about working hyper-locally. I was living in India at the time when the INGOs were completely maligned. There was a government report that accused them of contributing to 3% reduction in, something like 3 or 5% reduction in GDP, which is outrageous. But what happened was the local actors at the time, instead of Greenpeace or Amnesty or Oxfam, they ruined it for us. Because they used these international tactics that didn't work in the local context. And at the state level, there would be really good things happening in different states within India. And it enabled the government to malign all civil society, take away foreign funding licenses. And the only way they're rebuilding now is absolutely building strong local actors. And it's not all roses. It's a very difficult time for them. They can't get funding in. But that's the only way you can actually tackle, I think, these difficult circumstances, that you can use the broad brushstroke of, those Americans or those Brits or whomever are ruining it. So I think you have to build strong local national civil societies. And in the book, one of the things I say is the role of INGOs is actually to ensure that civil society everywhere is strong. I think that's the main way to combat that. Duncan, I didn't want you to ask a question. Isn't that terrible? Because you always challenge me. You said, where aid is only going to go with those countries that it's most difficult. I think the main thing I would say to that is money's not going to solve everything. And how many years of aid have we had where we haven't solved some of those difficult issues? These are political solutions. There are other solutions, and money's not necessarily the answer anyways. That's, what I would say.
Well, if people are hungry and got no vaccines, some money's needed.
Look, it's part of the answer. If you haven't got it, you have a problem. And look, as usual, Duncan asked one of the most awkward questions. But there's a really important point here that if you look at the current projections on the distribution of extreme poverty globally, that's this $3 threshold that the World Bank now uses. On the current projection, about 60% of extreme poverty will be in fragile and conflict-affected states. And within that group, we're talking about 20 or 25 countries. And these are countries who are typically recipients of large-scale, or relatively large-scale humanitarian aid and quite limited development finance. Now, the humanitarian aid, because of the way the system works, and we haven't gone into this, James, but I do think it's an important issue to raise. Humanitarian aid is short-term. It's always a year or less. It's voluntary, and it's highly unpredictable. You don't know whether it's coming or it's not coming. So you can't plan a health system intervention. You can do a one-off, we're going to vaccinate 500 children, or we're going to deliver nutrition supplements to 100,000 children. But you can't plan a system with humanitarian aid. Now, ironically, in many of these countries, you do actually have functioning safety net systems in place. I mean, Somalia is a very good example. People don't realize this, that you have a program in Somalia called Baxnano, which was actually initially funded by the World Bank and run by the World Food Programme, which is now government run, which reaches something like 4 million people. Now, on a regular monthly basis, and when there's a drought, it gets scaled up. Now, why is it? Why do you need a parallel humanitarian aid structure? Why can't you use that structure to deliver? It is to your point, Claire, that even in these extreme environments, you can very often build a system that has the potential to effect transformative change. But there's a broader point here as well, which is that as the extremes of development deprivation get more and more concentrated in those countries, and you have the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank trying to deliver more bond-financed support through their hard window to middle-income countries. How do you scale up support in those environments? Now, you have to do it through the concessional arms of regional development banks. It's one of the ways. But the African Development Bank is not authorized to issue bonds for its concessional arm, which the World Bank is. So, I think that gets us into some of the sort of technicalities of how do you reform the multilateral system. Actually, look, I sort of feel I should write an apology now to Laura's father, who's a Manchester United supporter. But there's a serious point in this, which is that I think we've all said in different ways that one of the reasons that we've lost the aid argument in the UK is because of this sort of political and cultural and social shift. And it is wrapped up, with what Claire has described as the rise of racism, the anti-immigrant sentiment, and all of that sort of stuff. And notwithstanding many of the criticisms that Deborah would make of INGOs, which I would agree with, in terms of the ways that they've operated. But the flip side of that is that NGOs, in critical times in their development, have gained a resonance and traction with public opinion because they've spoken about development in the right way. Now, the right way to talk about it isn't, look at us, see how many starving children we fed this morning. That doesn't, that's offensive, and it's ineffective as well. But I think reconnecting with these core principles of solidarity is something that the INGO sector can do. That doesn't mean they have to compete against local NGOs for delivering humanitarian aid. It means they can go back to some of their roots. That Oxfam and Save the Children were founded by people who stood for this, very passionately for this idea of solidarity. In Save the Children's case, people who took the decision to break the law and provide humanitarian support in what were categorized as hostile powers. In Oxfam's case, in the Second World War, to break the embargo against provision of aid in Greece. And to my mind, this is sort of what we need to go back to. It's progressive solidarity, and the INGO movement is one of the vehicles for delivering that and supporting groups in developing countries.
I think we're
so there's another task for you: get to the INGOs and get them into the right place.
That's right.
But Claire, they're not. You can overstate this stuff. Like, honestly, the people I worked with in Oxfam and in Save the Children joined out of solidarity. People in the policy departments of those organisations were driven by a sense of solidarity.
No, I know.
And there's lots of bullshit that goes with it, and the marketing and all of that sort of thing. But I guess what I'm saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
No, that's why I'm saying that there is a job for them to do, joining those organisations with that rethinking of the best role for those organisations. That's what I was trying to say, in support of what you're saying.
I think we're coming to a very great note on which to conclude. Duncan, you raised something very important, and when the whole issue of fragile states came up, it raised a big challenge to the donor community and all the international NGOs and whatnot, because mainstream neoliberal approach to aid was, elaborated by David Dollar at the World Bank, and he said all money should go to good performers, whereas all the need is often where performers not so good, So I think this idea also has to be put into the context of what's actually happened in the lead up to then DFID being dissolved in this country. There was increasing migration back to using, as Clare said, aid budgets for supplementing what MOD used to pay for. And every Office of State starting to take their chunk of aid. A lot of aid being spent on refugees in this country. And all of that happened before DFID was abolished. In fact, from 2015, you had to change in the historic definition of aid.
It didn't happen in my time.
No, it didn't. This happened after Clare. So I think this, the appeal at the end here is really important, that from a people's perspective and an NGO perspective in this area, we had original ideas about solidarity, motivating and voluntary work, motivating what was going on. And I think that's really important to bring back as a kind of set of principles and all of you have this huge role. We're putting a lot of responsibility on you, aren't we? Yeah, but all of you have this big role to play. I want us to collectively thank our speakers, and if you like, you can come and join us outside the White Horse pub around the corner. Thank you.